Hello and welcome to the first of our 2 history videos for TESP 124. That's Theology of Marriage. This is the first of 2 videos that we're going to watch. Okay, let's get started. So you guys read up to the end of chapter 3, and I'm going to pick up at chapter 4. It says chapter 5 on our slide, but there wasn't a lot to cover in chapter 4. But just so you know, it kind of summarized what was happening among the upper classes and lower classes. So there wasn't, if you can think about what we have today, there's this international economy that kind of binds countries together and obligations and duties and that sort of thing. We also have things like the United Nations that have these like international governing bodies that we can look to. They didn't have those back then. And marriage really acted as this diplomacy. It created peace between countries. It created military and economic ties. So marriage really functioned in a lot of those ways that other larger bodies do today. The lower classes were a lot more likely to marry for affection, to just be in love with someone and marry them. But rarely was this ever the primary reason that anyone would marry. But because the biggest concern for the lower class was how to run a household, how to run their local village economy. They wanted someone that would mesh well with the other folks. So in antiquity, the wealthy married to further their political power and social status, while the economic and the more practical everyday life affected the choices of partner for the lower class. All right, so chapter 5. Here we are in antiquity. There were changes in Athens going on. There used to be these things called family armies in ancient Athens, where people would war with one another. They'd basically get all their male relatives down to very young ages and go to war with one another. And the state was like, no more of this. Or go to war against other countries as well. The state was like, no, we have this interest in protecting our minors. And they started thinking about what the family should function as. They don't want any more family armies. They wanted people to start designing wills, and that the nuclear family became more culturally, because of these changes, became more culturally independent from the rest of the kin group. Now there was, again, an emphasis on the state. It was very important to be an Athenian, to feel an Athenian as you were an Athenian. So then there became this heavy emphasis on the state, and then a decreased importance on the kin group as well. The nuclear family was important, but not so much the extended family. So marriage became this very private relationship between 2 individuals and the children that they came from, or the children that came from them. Citizenship requires both parents to be Athenian at this point. Before it was just the father needed to be Athenian. And so this really removed an incentive to have a foreign alliance, right? If you needed citizenship to have both parents be Athenian born, that's really important. And so it really discouraged people from marrying outside of the Athenian group. To look to Rome really quickly, Rome was very patriarchal. If you think of the movie The Godfather, it's a really good model of that. Men were not really seen as being in families. They ruled over families. And it wasn't until you became the oldest man in the lineage that you became in charge of this. So even if you were a grandfather, for instance, if your father was still alive, you really didn't have a lot of power. It was the oldest male that had all the power. And so then once your father died, you would become the ruler over your own little dominion. All right. And then, there we go. Chapter 6. Now we're going to skip ahead to the Middle Ages. They run from the 5th to the 15th centuries when we talk about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, aristocracy began with polygamy. The Catholic influence was really weak at this point. So this is why all these men were having all these different wives. The Catholic Church had very little influence on the day-to-day politics and running of what was going on. Polygamy was really advantageous in some ways. For instance, it allowed for more wives, which allowed for more alliances, right? The more, if you have the King of Spain's daughter as your wife, the King of Norway's daughter as your wife, and the King of France's daughter as your wife, you're doing quite well. You have alliances with all those countries. However, this then becomes a problem. Now there are more families arguing over who has the proper heir, right? So if one queen was the first queen, and she had a daughter, but then had a son, and then another woman came and her son was older than the other son, but younger than the daughter, but she was the second wife. There are all sorts of complicated ways in how to determine who was the proper heir. The Catholic Church kind of snuck in very sneakily in this moment and said, you know what, we could do this monogamy thing and this would really solve everything. You wouldn't have all of this competition for heirs. But they said, but then we'd be really weak because we'd have only one alliance and everybody else had this. So they said, well, what if we get everyone to agree to it? And the Catholic Church really orchestrated this move away from polygamy within Europe. They talked to all of the monarchs at once, and all of them agreed that they would do it so long as everybody else did it. And the Catholic Church, and then after that happened, suddenly the Catholic Church had a lot of power that they didn't have in the past. Because then they could determine who was eligible to divorce or to annul and who could remarry. If the Catholic Church decided that you could only separate and therefore not remarry, it left you in a really panicked state because then there would not be an heir. Which brings us to women. Women actually exercised significant power in the aristocracy due to what was understood as the way biology happened at the time. So they believed that women in the West, that women actually did contribute biologically to their kids. In the East, women were seen as vessels, like the man planted his seed into her earth and up she grew, and up here she grew. But the women were actually believed to be contributing biologically to the children. So they had more significant power in the West. And also, if there was ever a divorce or an annulment, women would take their dowries and all of the people they brought with them, including any other alliances and power that they had with them. Also, with primogeniture, this power did diminish some. Primogeniture was just the idea that the firstborn son would get everything rather than having it spread equally among the children. But another really significant way that women could exercise their power is women could at any point in their marriage say, you know what, this is over, and they could leave to become a nun, and the men could not remarry. They were still technically considered married to those wives, but the men had no recourse to marry at this point. And so if there was no heir when she decided to leave, when she left, she took her ovaries with her, and the kingdom was pretty much done. So due to these strange understandings of biology and church power and other options women had considerable power in these days. They had to exercise it indirectly, but they had it. Okay. And going on to chapter 7. So we learned a lot about the aristocracy, but what did the other 5% of the other 95% of the population, what did they think about marriage? How did it work for them? The church was not really concerned with peasant marriages. They didn't define marriages for the lower classes for 8 centuries, so it took them some time to even bother to think about what that is. When they did divorce, women got a share of the estate that reflected the labor that she put into it. So marriage was based on consent for all people, but especially for the poor. That was the way, the merchants. Witnesses were not required. It was just a matter of 2 people agreeing, are we married? Yes. Okay, then we're married. However, this had some drawbacks. The church got really tired of settling disputes on who was married. Some people, if Bill went to go marry Sally, Tom would come up and say, no, Sally's married to me. And she'd say, no, I'm not. And he'd say, yes, you are. And there would be no one around to help find out what this dispute was all about, because there were no witnesses required and so forth. So the church says, okay, we're going to make this a little more official. And at this point, they decided to require a dowry, which is women bringing property into the relationship. Banns. Banns is just an announcement, a public announcement, usually for 3 weeks or so, that these people are going to get married. And if you have any problems, you should come forward. Like if you're married to this person, you should come forward and say something. And that it must take place in a church. However, doctrinally, all that was required was that was consent. So it didn't really change doctrine so much as it changed policy and practice. It's a lot less relevant, this whole idea of clandestine marriage and everything. And then clandestine marriage just means hidden marriage. So before marriages, when people would just base it on their consent, they might have a reason to keep it secret. For example, in slave history of the United States, clandestine marriage was declared illicit and disobedient since this time, but it was still considered valid. So two people could agree to marry one another. There have been times, such as slave America, where the church has said, no, it's not illicit and disobedient because of certain circumstances people find themselves in. So, for example, if two slaves were forbidden to legally, publicly marry, then they could just marry, or if it was in danger, if their slave master was going to lord it over their heads, like I'll sell one of you off and that sort of thing, they might prefer to marry in private, and then the church would be okay with it in that circumstances. So the American bishops came out in that point during slavery. But the whole idea of clandestine marriage and everything is a lot less relevant than people would think, because marriage, again, was not about two people in these days. It was about the community. So having a clandestine marriage didn't really serve a lot of purposes for the poor, because as soon as you got married, it was someone who would enter into work with you. This was someone who would cooperate with you and the rest of the community that you lived in. So it wasn't about two people, but the whole community. The community had a stake because the family was seen as an economic unit, right? It wasn't this private thing of joy and nurturance like we tend to think of it today. Before, the family was very much an economic unit, and the whole village would decide together how, when, and what to plant. So marriage partners needed to bring value to this local economy. So everyone in the village cared about who you married, not because they liked you and they wanted to see you with a nice lady or a nice guy. It was because they were looking out for themselves and the rest of the village. If people bemoan divorce and as something that this modern era had it, they are quite mistaken. Separation, not divorce, was granted in certain cases of adultery, heresy, and cruelty. Annulments were granted in other circumstances. And just to clarify the difference, so divorce again means that yes, you were married, but now you no longer are. That's divorce. We're very familiar with that. Separation is you are still currently married, and so you are obligated to one another insofar as economics goes and that sort of thing. But you may not marry other people. You are still considered married to one another, but you may separate because of adultery, heresy, or cruelty. Annulments, though, say that you were never married to begin with. I don't know. Yeah, now that I think about it, there are other religions that grant annulments. States do grant annulments. So if you get married to someone and let's say you find out right after the wedding, someone tells you, oh yeah, she's been sleeping with someone else, or he's been sleeping with someone else, you can get an annulment which says this marriage was never valid to begin with. I married this person under the pretense, and we never consummated our marriage, and so it was never fully complete, so our marriage never happened. So yes, annulments means the marriage never took place. There was something wrong from the beginning that didn't allow it to fully take sacramentally, as you might say. So annulments were granted in a few cases. In the case of impotence, because again, this is coming from the perspective that consummation, having sex, consummate means to make perfect. So getting married in the church was basically the beginning of the wedding of the two people, and it was finished when those two people actually had sex. So impotence, a man being unable to have sex, was a ground for annulments because the marriage had never fully taken place. Close relation, or consanguinity is the fancy word that they would use. But if you were too closely related, then they're like, oh no, this is not okay. You were never married to begin with. And previously being married. So again, there's no divorce. So if you lied about having been married in the past, you're still considered married to that person. And so if it ever came to light, then they said, oh, then this marriage never actually took place because we don't allow people to be married to two people. So yes, those were the 3 cases that annulments were granted in. And so marriage among the merchants, right? So not all of the non-aristocracy were poor. The merchants were very wealthy people. And so it was a little different for them than for the other peasants. They were a lot closer in socially to the aristocracy, and in fact, in the way that they modeled their own lives. They had these clannish alliances of being together. So they did use marriage for political gain and that sort of thing. And there were factions among them vying for power. So they really looked a lot like the aristocracy in these ways. And they also had a lot of money. And so suddenly inheritance was a big deal. Who was the rightful heir? And so because of inheritance, they were a lot less likely to have children out of wedlock. And marriage at this time was also as understood as a transition into adulthood. This has different meanings for men and women, though, this rite of passage and what it means. For men, it was being independent. A lot of men suddenly, rather than being under the control of their own father, got to be the one in control. So it was great for them. For women, though, it was problematic. It actually restricted their legal standing. A single woman or a widow could represent herself legally, but a married woman could only take someone to court, for example, through her husband. Her husband would have to do it on her behalf. And they could not sell land. That was another thing. Besides going to court, they couldn't sell land. Their husband had to do all of these things. Let's see. She could never put themselves in a system of pledge, which was something that existed then, where you would have this formal reciprocity. It's like a contract, but you would formally, just verbally agree to do something with someone. But she could not do that. Only her husband could do it for her. And ultimately, they had to be obedient to what their husbands wanted. Oh, not quite there yet. So marriage created this economic interdependence, though, for both men and women. So economic interdependence, yes, but political dependence for women. So there was different experiences of this of marriage for men and women, depending on if you're looking at economically, which husband and wives depended upon one another, or politically, in which case the women lost power and depended upon their husbands. But there wasn't really much sentimentality if death ever took a spouse. Among these lower class people, marriages were really seen as a business partnership. And so if death took a spouse, a new spouse would fill in this job. It was like, oh, my husband was a blacksmith. Like, you're going to come and be the blacksmith now. And because we have this blacksmith business to run. So a new spouse or a child would often fill in. All right, and that brings us to our question. What do marriage? So this is the question. So what you guys can do, what I would suggest doing at this point is jotting down some notes. So either if you're planning to come to our first discussion group, great. I'm really excited to meet you guys on Zoom. If you're planning to come, just jot down some notes so that you know what this answer is in your head and you can actually discuss it, because it's all fresh right now in your mind. Of what you want to say and how this is relevant. When you come to the Zoom meeting, you might have forgotten what exactly was going on, what the context is to this question. So if you're going to do that, go ahead and jot down some notes. If you're not able to make the Zoom meeting, go ahead and just pause this video and then go straight to your the class discussion. This is class discussion question 1A Q2. So it's for our meeting for our first Zoom meeting, and the second question. The first question I'm actually going to ask more towards the end because it's more summative. But yes, go ahead and go to 1A Q2 and just pause this video and write in your answer. And here's the question. What do marriage and adulthood, right? We were talking about this rite of passage. What do marriage and adulthood have to do with one another today? And what milestones do you hope to achieve, if any, before marriage? So go ahead and think about that. Marriage as a rite of passage and political and economic relationships between the sexes were very different then. What does it mean today for you, today? And then what are you hoping to achieve before you get married, if anything? All right. And then let's move onward. This gets us to chapter 8 in Kunz's book. This is the dawn of the modern age. This is the new partnership schema between husband and wife. Again, so marriage was this rite of adulthood. It broke people from their birth families. It changed them from children to masters and mistresses, right? This is where our Mr. and Mrs. come from that we use today as titles for men and women. People would work in young adulthood, usually as servants, in order to save money to begin a family. And so this made marriage, they postponed marriage. Marriage happened a lot later. And the meaning of marriage changed, right? It wasn't about bringing women into the family for reproductive purposes. The upper class, it was important for producing heirs and that sort of thing. With the lower classes, it was important to have kids to work the farm. Now the woman was not seen as a reproductive entity, but as a productive entity. She would form a productive partnership with her spouse. It wasn't, and now we see a movement happening from the clan-based with really strong kinship networks with extended family to a more nuclear family model, where a man, for example, might work in an orchard to pick olives, and the wife would press those olives into oil. So they would need each other in order for their family's business to run. Men would typically do jobs in the field because women tended to be in charge of the kids, and so tying whatever economic work they did to the home facilitated all of that. But yeah, so we have a movement happening from the clan-based family to the nuclear family, and from a biological understanding of family and partner and between the spouses to a more economic model. And women were seen as bringing skills and assets rather than being seen as dependent upon their husband. And starting a marriage really followed the patterns of starting a business. And if you saw, there was often a marriage boom after plague deaths. There would be a big plague, spouses would get wiped up. And if we look at it back from our point of view, we might say, oh, and then people fell in love with other people. But what really happened is jobs opened up, if you think about it this way. Most of the women who got married were past childbearing age, actually. And they were looking for someone to continue the family business. Marriage helped fill this. It was the ultimate sort of contract. And neighbors, as this movement away from the kin base to the nuclear family happened, neighbors started to fulfill a lot of the social relief that kin networks provided in the past. let's compare all of this to the classic patriarchy of antiquity and more classically at that time. Okay, so in Europe, women were under the control of their spouses. In antiquity. In patriarchal societies, women could bend these rules to make it work for them. One of the things that women do would have many sons. So if women had 4 kids and they were all sons, it was very frequent, if we're looking back at birth records, for that woman not to have more kids. But if her first 4 were girls, you would see that woman having a lot more kids. So having many sons was a way to make sure that women, even if they weren't allowed power, could still wield power later on. This is a way to make it work for them. Then they also would try to make sure there's that, the prejudice that the mother always gets in between the son and his wife, says its roots in these patriarchies. And because if their son would get too close to their wives, they would become their wife would become that first allegiance. So having this mama's boy and making sure that his first allegiance was to his mother was a really important strategy that women took on. And this is why actually a lot of women were resistant to pro-woman changes. So if they're trying to make a more egalitarian society, it really disrupts the power dynamic that they have set up. So if they stopped having kids because they had their 4 sons that they wanted, they thought they were going to wield a lot of power, but the neighbor next door has 8 kids, 4 are girls and 4 are boys, suddenly she might have a lot more power. And then if women are allowed equal power, perhaps the woman in the relationship, so looking at the second factor now, making sure their sons are not too close to their wives, if suddenly their daughters-in-law could have a lot of power, they could tell their mother-in-law to get out and it wouldn't matter what the husband said. Sometimes women really don't want to see patriarchal structures change because they've set up systems to make it, even though it's patriarchal, to make it work for them so they can wield power indirectly. All right. And this brings us to the Reformation in the 1500s. There was a big debate of celibacy and marriage that was happening at this point. This is the first time, actually, that we see love being used for the marital relationship. Before, love, as far as Christian love went, was something that we used for God and for something that we used to our neighbor, not for the marriage relationship. And this is where a lot of the Protestants are saying, no, this whole idea of celibacy being so great and marriage being this backup plan is so wrong. The marital relationship can really reflect God's love. And this is when they started taking marriage more seriously as this solemn act, not supposed to be this fun sort of event. For example, we must respect the couple's right to privacy. No more loud celebrations. The big drunken revelry of the reception, that needed to be toned down. No seeing them off to the marriage bed. They used to take couples off and say loud and raunchy things to them as they were going off to bed. Or sometimes they would try to sneak in during the middle of the night and try to catch them in the act. No more of that, says the Reformation folks. Also waking them up in the mornings. Sometimes they thought it was really funny to wake them up with a bucket of ice water, water pulled from the stream, that sort of thing. But yes, no more of that, they say. They want to make sure that everything surrounding the wedding and the events that follow really respects the dignity of marriage. This is a really important phrase that comes out of the Reformation, the dignity of marriage. So that's not just the dignity of celibacy anymore, it's also the dignity of marriage. Marriage also becomes more strict in several ways. First of all, the age is raised as to when you can officially be wed. Clandestine marriages are now considered invalid. Parental permission is required in order to be married. Sex while engaged is legally discouraged. And finally, the fifth one is sex outside of marriage is subject to civil penalties. So these really big regulations are imposed because the idea of marriage as this estate and institution of dignity is really being emphasized. It was also at the same time, even though we're emphasizing love, it was considered unseemly for married couples to be too adoring of one another. And there was also a big double standard, no surprise, that men were allowed more sexual freedom to have affairs, mistresses, and whatnot, depending on the culture, while women were not allowed these things. Which brings us to our question. This is going to be question 1A. So just to get my coding scheme clear for you guys, 1 signifies week 1. A signifies the first meeting of the week. So we're going to have another meeting that's going to be 1B. And this is Q3. This is question 1A Q3. So week 1 week 1 question that we're going to discuss in our first Zoom meeting of week 1, question 3. And again, if you can't make it to the Zoom meeting, post it online. So post again, and just to clarify, go ahead and post first your response to this question, and then your own personal answer, and then respond to 2 classmates' responses, and then respond to 2 responses, and to respond to responses. Yes. So we're going down 3 levels: your initial, a response to another person, and then a response to a response. And please make sure that you know that this is not just an off-the-cuff sort of answer. It requires a lot of research and thought, outside sources, that sort of thing. And make sure you bring all of those in if you're going to be answering them in the online forum, not in the Zoom meeting. That's not expected, but you're going to be committing to that for the hour. Anyways, to our question. Up to the Reformation, marriage was a bond that united 2 communities or families. This is a stark contrast to the couple-centered bond within marriage today. What are some of the advantages of this previous community-centered notion of marriage that we do not get to enjoy today? And then the other question is, are there ways to integrate elements of these, or is our notion of marriage too different? So yes, we see this shift happening now from a community-centered notion of marriage to one that's more on the nuclear family. It's going to become even more centered on the nuclear family in later centuries. So what are some of the advantages of this community-centered notion of marriage that we don't have today? And then are there ways to integrate these into our current culture, or is it just too different? All right, and that brings us to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is about the year 1700 at this point. This is when we start to see a really important transition in bonds and the way that we start to understand marriage and the family. The picture on the right is a lot more of this community-centered understanding of this image, these hearts linking together. Marriage united a community. Marriage was a part of the community, and it brought individuals together. This was the previous understanding of notion. This is the way marriage had been for millennia. Not about bringing 2 people together, but about bringing families together, other groups together in a collective shared endeavor. This is around 1700 is when we see this really big transition where it goes from bringing families together to bringing 2 individuals together, as the image on the right shows. So we see this really significant transition happening. One of the ways that we can see this is why people are seeking annulments at this point. So before the 1760s, people sought annulments based on emotional attachment at only 10%. Right, 10% of annulments before the 1760s were sought on the basis, the fact that they stopped loving their spouse. After the 1770s, this rises to 40%. Nearly half of annulments, it goes from 10% to nearly half of annulments were sought on the basis of the fact that they stopped loving each other. This suddenly became a legitimate reason to dissolve a marriage. At the same time, wife beating culturally became this lower class vice. This was not something that middle and upper income folks did, and even among the lower class, it was frowned upon. And so this became this very déclassé sort of thing. And so we see this idea that husbands and wives should have affection for one another. And that should be the primary thing that cements them together. Quite revolutionary at the time. And speaking of revolutions, this was the age of revolution. We're thinking French Revolution, American Revolution. With all of these revolutions, people are questioning all sorts of things, right? We had this monarchical structure in place. What do we want? What sort of egalitarian, how far can egalitarianism go? Does it even go into the marriage? And some were saying, yes, we need to really re-examine how we think of marriage. This was the first calls for women's equality that we have in the European and American world. People, in any sort of significant way. People are saying equal inheritance for daughters and illegitimate children, that we should not be parsing these groups out, not just legitimate sons, but any child, right? If this is a bond of love, and full participation of wives in civil society, commerce, the market, whatnot, and in government. They wanted to see that. Not to say that there were not many who were against these changes. Many people were. But what ended up happening was this really crazy mix of patriarchy and egalitarianism. So women and men were so very different in their natures, they cannot be compared as superior and inferior. This was the philosophy at the time. So yes, they should be equal to one another in dignity, but they are not the same. But they're so different. They started being seen as opposites rather than partners. Remember, if we are an economic partnership, there might be some tasks that you are better at and I am better at, but together we work as a pair. And suddenly men and women start to see one another as opposites. But so they weren't a matter of being superior or inferior anymore. There was an exclusion of women from public life, as a mark of their deference from their unique gifts and disposition. So women, they're saying, going into public life is not so great because you have this gentle femininity to you. You do much better in the home with your care and your patience and nurturance and that sort of thing. And this is what we call gender essentialism. And we'll go into this a little more next week when we start talking about the difference between sex and gender. But yes, so we've got this strange mix of patriarchy and equality. So if we look from the men's side to the women's side, just go across, what does it mean to be male or female? And people still today subscribe to these sorts of essentialism. Essentialism will vary from culture to culture. What a culture of a tribe in sub-Saharan Africa thinks of as masculine and feminine is going to differ from what a millennial student at SCU thinks of as feminine and masculine. Anyway, so these are always shifting, but this gives you an idea of what some of the things are that people can identify as this. So men do, women feel, men think, women express, men analyze, women intuit, men make decisions, women just are, men lead, women follow, men give, women receive, men please, and women create. So there's this whole dichotomy that's set up, and they complement one another, and there's not a better or worse in this schema, they would argue. However, it does really obviously pigeonhole people into specific rules. So this was used to justify the interdependence of the sexes, what we call complementarity. So whatever the man cannot do it on his own, the woman cannot do it on her own. He has certain gifts and she has certain gifts, and his strengths fill in her weaknesses and vice versa. So this is the whole thing about gender complementarity. Complementarity is viewed by many as sexist, but it was a vast improvement upon previous views of women. And again, these were not just new philosophical meanderings. It wasn't just that there are these people who are chilling out in the pub and they were wondering, what should we talk about next? Oh, let's talk about this difference of the sexes. No, the way that suddenly politics was being structured, economy was being structured, because we're talking about a transition from feudalism into capitalism. We're talking about a transition from a monarchical-based politics to a more democratic-based politics. So lots of transitions are happening. And this was a real expression of how men and women were experiencing their new economic relations with one another. So it's not to say that it was real that men and women act particular ways, but this is to say that they looked around at their lived worlds, and this was what made sense to them to explain what they saw. And so this brings us to our next question. What is your understanding of gender and the relations between the sexes? And this is going to be question 1A Q4. 1A Q4. And I'm going to also just put up here as well, just put it in some text. This is going to be question 1A Q1. This is going to kind of summarize everything we're going to look at. This just gives us a nice blank space, though, for me to fill this in. To summarize, once we finish this video, go back to this question and think about it. You can just look at it on our Moodle site if you don't want to write it down. But after this video finishes, ask yourself, what do you think of this very practical understanding of marriage and history, right? And economic cooperation, looking for the aristocracy. It was about political power and that sort of thing. What do you think of this very practical understanding of marriage and history, which some societies still practice today with arranged marriage and whatnot? And then how does it compare to what you want from a marriage? Kind of a big question. So I'm going to put this text here right now for you to read it for the visual folks, but it's also in our discussion 1A collection of questions. It's 1A Q1 in our first module. So yes, these are the two questions that I want you to think about right now. Okay. And we also have this move from barter to cash right now. That's happening, which is really significant on the family. This is a little house, a picture of the little house on the prairie, folks. But barter was used to characterize the vast majority of economic transitions. But then with this wide spread of wage labor, people needed cash. But people couldn't live on cash alone. The goods for sale were not ready-made for use. People would get a bolt of fabric. You couldn't go to, unless you were planning to pay a lot of money, you wouldn't go in and buy a ready-made dress or a ready-made shirt. You would go into a store and buy a bolt of fabric. And then the woman would be in charge of doing these. It was integrated into some of her domestic duties of what she did as far as the family economy. So the wife did these chores in addition to the wage work that she would do on the side as well, to do laundry and that sort of thing, to card wool, to make it into thread and that sort of thing. But as children entered wage work, which happens, during an early capitalism, then she stays home and does the domestic duties entirely as part of her own job. And this gave rise to this idea of what we today call the cult of domesticity. This is where women really, this was the Victorian ideal, that women stayed home, cared for the family, managed the house, did all of these sort of homemaking tasks, while the men would go out into the world of work, into public life, and have their world. So their two worlds were very divided into two, but this home life was the private life. Men were in the public sphere, and really never the two really met. It was this home was this haven from the heartless world. And we can see this cult of domesticity in a couple ways. There is this changing role of the wife. Check out that picture of the corset, by the way. Like, I could not believe what I was seeing, but yes, it's true. It really happened. Advice books no longer assumed a male presence in domestic work. We see this shift happening when we look at advice books. What men are supposed to do around the house, what women are supposed to do around the house. Suddenly it's just, this is what you do, this is what you do, and it's geared for women, about what women are supposed to do. Men became associated with work outside the home. Two different worlds they're inhabiting now, rather than this yoke mate of we work together. The yoke mate, just to clarify this for people who aren't familiar with the term, a yoke is something that in old agrarian societies where they would use animals to plow the field, would tether two animals together so that together they could pull the plow. So it's the same sort of thing for married couples. Together they would work and labor together. So housekeeping was transformed into homemaking, right? Rather than actually being seen as a contribution to the survival of the household, this economic endeavor, it became seen as an act of love. This this transition from house to home. They went from sharing tasks to sharing feelings, from yoke mates, being work partners, into soulmates. Very fascinating transition. And we can see how this really reinforced what was going on at the time. Men in their specific qualities that they believed were innate to men at this time, put them into public life, whereas women in their innate qualities put them into private life and homemaking and childcare and those tasks. And these separate spheres really, they led to interdependence, which was interesting, that men realized that they needed women and women realized that they needed men. But it also drove an emotional and social wedge between the sexes. They started to see the opposite sex as the alien sex, this strange person that was nothing like themselves. Things like platonic relationships between the sexes would have been absolutely unheard of. It also had a few other repercussions. Homosexuality was not considered okay, but same-sex affection was fine and normal. You can see some of this happening at this time with love letters that men and women wrote to one another. Very erotic language was being used, but not to have a serious, committed, lifelong relationship. That was not okay. But same-sex affection was fine and normal. But courting then also changed. It became an interaction of two stereotypes rather than two individuals. Men knew what they were supposed to be as a courting man, and women knew what they were supposed to be as a courted woman. And they acted according to these roles rather than who they really were, which doesn't bode well for marriage when you start acting like who you really are. And then there was a whole idea that women should remain at home to preserve women from the wilds of the outside world, of this terrible and awful, crazy place of politics and commerce, really dividing the whole society into public life where men belonged and private life where women belonged. Middle-class men had to support themselves for the very first time, requiring that they postpone marriage until after they had finished schooling and really established themselves, which really took a while. So this is when you start seeing these really big age gaps between men and women, because men aren't really able to marry until they are much older, and women have picked up on a lot of the tasks and duties that it takes to manage a home fairly early compared to men. And so this led to these middle-class values of postponing pleasures. When you think about what middle-class virtues are, postponing pleasures, male self-control, and especially female virtue, which really morphed into the 19th century into something different, into women's innate sexual purity. A real fascination and focus on women's sexuality in the 19th century. We'll see exactly how that plays out in a moment. And men who lost their job lost their manhood, right? Because now suddenly they are the only ones. It's not they and their wives together, where if the crop goes bad, they both feel that burden. Suddenly, if the man loses his job, he's lost his manhood, and he can't appeal to this old notion of yoke mates that he once had. All right, well, this concludes our first video. Go ahead and consider those questions. If you are doing the online participation, you're not able to make it to the Zoom meeting, I would recommend doing it now while it's still fresh in your head. And then you can go on to the second video that we're going to look into Kuntz's book a little more deeply.